Hello, and welcome to Saving People, Queering Things, a supernatural podcast. We were previously known as Driver Picks the Podcast, and the episode you're about to listen to was recorded under that name. Though our name has changed as of season 3, our show hasn't changed that much. Our structure and theme-based discussions are the same, and we're so glad you're here. Now, let's get on the road. Hello, and welcome to Driver Picks the Podcast, the show where we talk about ghosts, road trips, and free will through every episode of the TV series Supernatural. Today, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 6, Skin, through the theme of sacrifice. I'm Abigail, your host and former owner of a very Dean-esque leather jacket that I wore to absolute shreds in college.
I'm Hannah, rotating host, and my gender, I have to admit, is absolutely the bond between the brothers. I couldn't pick one, so I had to pick both.
I'm Claire, and I'm in love with every female character that doesn't get enough screen time or get to speak to another woman in this entire show.
Which there are both a lot of those women and not nearly enough.
Correct. But I am in love with all of them. There's enough room in this heart for them all.
I love that. It is now time for our series recap, the road so far of season 1.
Mary Winchester is dead, John Winchester is missing, and their two sons, Sam and Dean, are on the road to find their dad and avenge both their mother and Sam's girlfriend Jessica, who were both killed by an unknown supernatural being. John has left several mysterious clues about his location, and so Sam and Dean are saving people and hunting things as they search for him. Along the way, they've encountered and successfully exorcised a demon, which will become important for the future lore of this world. However, the trail for John continues to be windy and confusing, and they seem to be no closer to finding him than when they set out.
Wonderful, and we are all caught up. That brings us to this episode and to our 30-second recap segment. In this segment, we will each take a turn recapping what happens in this episode. I will count you in. 3.
Okay.
Are you actually ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
While on the road to find their father, Sam and Dean are interrupted yet again by one of, this time, Sam's school friends, a brother-sister duo, the brother of whom has just been accused of killing his girlfriend. As they sort of infiltrate the world of these friends, they slowly find out that this world's actually been infiltrated by someone they term a shapeshifter, someone who's taking the faces of people's beloved ones and killing them. Of course, he has to turn into Dean, tormenting Sam before they can slaughter him, get back on the road with each other rather than their friends.
All right, count me in.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, go.
In this episode, we see a nasty skin-changing, shape-shifting being. I don't really know that we ever sort of get an idea of what they are. Just committing a lot of violence against women in the forms of their most beloved male figure. So their husband, their boyfriend. That figure shapeshifts into Dean at one point, and basically it's all just kind of a nightmare. Thank you.
Amazing.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Okay, so Sam gets an email from an old college friend saying that another friend has been arrested for killing their girlfriend, but it doesn't really make sense because that person was seems to be in 2 places at one time, and they go and investigate it. It turns out it's a shapeshifter, and that's been committing all these violent crimes, and eventually the shapeshifter shifts into Dean, and while he's in the shape of Dean is able to kill him, and then they head back onto the road. We will now move into our theme discussion. Our chosen theme this week is the theme of sacrifice. And
of course,
Hannah noted when we were watching this that we have had absolutely great luck with these themes so far. Every time they are just very on point for the episode. So I know I have notes. I know you guys have notes. Take it away. Where do you see the theme in this episode?
Well, I'll go first, just to claim what might be the easiest representation. I know we've talked a couple different times, right, as these monsters of the week echo the narrative of these brothers, sort of the point of the show, but seeing it really, really clearly in that they're helping out Sam's college friends or school friends, right? The whole discussion that he and Dean have from the start is, you really should be letting go of these friends. It's really difficult. You need to just chop them out of your life because they're never going to understand and they're never going to be able to support you, right? The very first conversation they have is about how Sam should be sacrificing these friends for his life hunting on the road. And you sort of see this tension where that's what Dean presumably has done and what Sam doesn't want to do, sort of summarily ending with, again, he drives away from these friends. Even though they know what he's doing, the implication is that she's not going to be telling other people and he's returning to life on the road. So throughout the episode, you kind of have this idea of this tension of, should he be sacrificing his friends? Should he be sacrificing like his integrity as a hunter, his safety as a hunter, their safety as people who know him? And I think that's really neatly summarized at the end, right? His friend Becky now knows what he does, what the family business is, and she asks him if Jess knew, right? And he kind of hums around it for just a second before he says that no, she didn't. And this implication that she would have been sacrificed as well, I think, is hidden right under that surface. Yeah, that's I think the absolute biggest place that I spotted it throughout the episode.
Mm-hmm. I think the interesting thing with that ties back to previous episodes and what we know of Sam particularly so far is that this is not the first time Sam is being asked to make kind of a choice between either his family and hunting and that life and, you know, the life that he could have, the Stanford, becoming a lawyer, having friends, and they're always juxtaposed as one or the other when it comes to Sam, especially right now. And previously, we know that Sam made the sacrifice, kind of chose the thing to sacrifice, and that was his family. And he was only really forced to make that choice because John said, you know, if you leave, don't come back. So it's interesting to kind of see some of those echoes of, okay, now he's back with Dean, he's back with his family, and he's being challenged to then again make that sacrifice, this time on the opposite end of like his friends. And I mean, they even say it in their, like, that it's, you know, Dean says you can't get close to people, and there's this implication of like that it's dangerous both for you and for them if you have people in your life outside of the world of hunting.
Yeah, not to be going off of your notes that I can see, right, but even right when the shapeshifter is Dean, so to speak, right? Dean's not the shapeshifter. When the shapeshifter is Dean, that back and forth dialogue that he has with Sam about, and he's sort of manifesting, right, Dean's, what he knows about Dean from assuming his form, but also sort of Sam's worst nightmares of what Dean could be, and talking about, I stayed behind, you got to go to Stanford, you got to get out, you got to have a life. Like the implication of the sacrifices Dean made, when the narrative has sort of been about the sacrifices that Sam is being pressured to make. Choice.
So one of the things that's kind of interesting here, and this is not directly related to the theme, but it is a thing that I was thinking about, was when the shifter is in Dean's form, there is a really interesting mix of like the shifter knows a lot about Dean and is kind of collecting that information by being in his form, but also is doing a lot of interpretation of like, what does he think will be effective to use against Sam in this instance. So he like you said, Hannah, he plays on the things he knows, but also on the things I think he thinks that will really hit Sam the worst, that will really be the worst kind of betrayal. And it is very interesting when it comes to the lore of, we don't get a lot of information in this episode about how shifters entirely work, but and I also just noticed the shifter being actually like is being presented as if Dean's real feelings are being manifested, but the shifter's actually very unlike him in most significant ways. Like even some of the, one thing I hadn't noticed in past is some of the acting choices there are very obvious when you've, especially, I mean, I've watched the show a lot, so I've seen Jensen Ackles play Dean over many years, and the shifter does not feel like Dean, and it doesn't have some of the same mannerisms. Is looks like him from the outside, but I find it interesting. Like nobody in this episode figures out that it's the shifter and not Dean, other than Sam. And Sam knows almost instantly, like very quickly. Sam figures it out, and he says it's because Dean catches the keys with the wrong hand for where his injury was. But I think it's also just that the shifter doesn't feel like Dean. The shifter's got a different sort of really dark energy. And at this point in the show, Dean does not have that same kind of like cynicism, I think, even.
Yeah, he masquerades as it, but he doesn't actually have the cynicism. I think that's sort of, I would agree. I think that's sort of the piece that the shifter misses, is how much, and again, I might be coming from the fandom reading into Dean, but how much of Dean is a performance? How much of it is, right, a dad's jacket bigger than he is? How much of it is, I act like I sleep around a lot and I just kind of don't, like this man giving off this very big, larger than life performance. So the shifter's like, obviously, Dean is this very cynical man. And underneath, we know Dean isn't. We know that he is always hoping for the best outcome.
Even when he's telling Sam he should sacrifice, the reasons he's giving and the way he's couching that is actually fairly compassionate. It's because I think Dean genuinely doesn't think it's not. I don't think it's the same as with maybe John, where I think John was a lot harsher on both of them in terms of like, you can't have connections outside of this world. But I think for Dean, the way he's presenting it to Sam is, I don't think he's thought of it as any other way, and I don't think he means it in a harsh. I think he's trying. I think he truly believes that's what's best for Sam. And Claire, it looked like you were about to say something.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because I don't know, like, this is like episode 6, right? So I don't actually know that the audience would know the subtleties and the difference in the deeds
Exactly.
Necessarily at this point, right? Like, I think we have the advantage of having watched Dean for so many seasons, and what I think this episode does really, okay, Hannah goes, me? I haven't watched any Supernatural. Some of us did reblog a lot of Dean fan art, and some of us didn't. And
I wasn't one of them, so keep it to yourself, bro.
Well, I don't know. I'm the one that accidentally deleted my blog. You still have a working, functional blog that has posts from 2013. I'm sure we could find.
Anyway, I think we have enough context. I think Jensen Ackles tangibly acted different enough as the shifter.
Yeah. If you'd listen to what I was gonna say, you would understand what I'm about to say. Here's the thing: it's 6 episodes. I think what this episode does is it plays into all the audience's worst fears about Dean, right? So it gives us what Dean could be if he was hyper masculine and super callous and like as sort of misogynistic as he kind of projects himself to be, right?
And if he genuinely blamed Sam,
right,
or how much his life sucks.
And so what it does is it does this thing of like both plays into audience fears about Dean as the older brother, because we're coming in with Sam as the point of view character, so we're automatically empathizing with Sam's whole shit. Like, we see what Dean could be, and so then, like, this is a great episode to give us that very sympathetic view of Dean. This is the episode that for me, when I see Dean's the co-protagonist, a deuteragonist, instead of a fucking, like, secondary brother, right? Like, I know he is, but because we're coming in from Sam's point of view, this is the episode that I think really, for me, goes, oh no, okay, these two are equal. And in fact, we're understanding Dean as sympathetic as Sam, and we're coming in from his point of view in a similar way. We just weren't necessarily set up that way.
That's actually really cool. I like that. That's really interesting, because I think there are like moments of you get that in a previous episodes, but I think you're right. This is like a fairly significant point for us showing who he could be and who he is instead.
Right. I think I actually did want to ask a question. Although no, I'll wait to ask this question later in the episode. But I do think this is sort of the ultimate like masculinity fantasy episode. And I want you guys' opinions on why do you think in the first season the writers were like, you know what we should do? We should have a bad guy who looks like our protagonist commit violence against women in this particular way. Like, what do you think about that? Slash, do you have
Are you
I have
asking it
thoughts
now
about
or
it.
later in the episode?
No, I'm asking this now. I have another question
Okay.
for later.
The answer is just misogyny. Like, it's right. Like, it's just stupid easy. So I'm thinking about right. Like, I mean, I think you already said it, right? That if this episode is the projection of the masculine fantasy, right? If we're playing into this idea of Dean as who he projects he is, if he was actually the way he is perceived or seen, what would that actually look like? And I think, again, going back to the idea of Dean as a performance and a projection, right? I think the very first instant that we start feeling that discomfort is we know that it's the shapeshifter and they're with Becky, but it's this moment of you feel a lot of sympathy for the shapeshifter, right? He starts talking about being like feeling hideous and talking about being deformed, right? Playing into this disability aspect of something very Phantom of the Opera-esque.
And talks about loneliness too.
Yes, loneliness. I was like, this is such a Phantom moment, right? Of I was hideous and nobody could bear to look at me until I could take on another shape. Like, won't you just love me? And this really interesting role of essentially the shifters searching for somebody to love him the way that all of his victims love the person whose form he's assuming. And then it's all fine and dandy, and we are kind of getting this strange amount of sympathy for the shifter and getting a hint at their lore, like we talked about. And then it's the moment that Becky asks them to leave, right? She says, I think you need to go. And he doesn't go. And then leans forward, right, and smells her hair. And that's when the horror of the show starts creeping up. It's up until that moment, you're feeling the sympathy for the monster. You're there with the monster. You're starting to deconstruct the monster. And that's the moment he becomes monstrous again. Mm-hmm. And also the moment that it stops feeling even remotely like Dean.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would argue that it doesn't prior, but I agree with you that, yeah, that's a moment where there's a very clear line. It is interesting, like, to go back to your question, Claire, that the writers choose to kind of, not just that they choose to place Dean in this specific role, like they choose to have the shifter shift into Dean and not Sam. Right? Is an interesting choice, and I think misogyny is a pretty clear answer to that. But the other question that is a little more even like kind of concerning from a writing misogyny point of view is why this monster is being constructed in this particular way. Like, why we're like, I don't like, I appreciate that they were trying to give us more of an interesting monster than just like this monster is shifting into people and killing other people. I appreciate that they're trying to vary the kind of monsters, because at the end of the day, most monsters in this show are trying to kill people. So like they're trying to add something to that, and we've seen that in a couple of the previous episodes. But we already knew prior to the scene with Becky, we already knew that this monster, the shifter, shifts into men and kills their significant female partners. So like we already knew this monster preyed on women in their intimate relationships. And it's interesting that then they go the extra length of like, they're not even like, Dean and Becky are not even in a relationship. They just like this chose to do this super predatory sort of thing, and to put one of our protagonists in that role. And I both appreciate and really hate the way they're trying to do the sympathy piece. I think when you like know what's coming when you're watching this episode, it becomes way more uncomfy. And yeah, I don't know. I think this season in general, like there are a lot of that trope of like predatory male character or monster preying on female character is really common in these first couple of seasons. And some of it is interesting commentary considering the like real life misogyny and violence against women that exists in the world. Like some of that makes a lot of sense, that monsters also in this society, in this world, take their cue from, in a lot of ways, the humans that prey on, where women get preyed on. But the show also leans into that in some ways that normalize that. The women are always the ones that get the short end of the stick. They're always the ones that are dying so that a male character can grow or change or further the plot, and that's unfortunate.
I think it also brings up two really interesting points. Go on,
God, not us doing the same thing, starting to speak and then stopping. No, Hannah, I was just gonna say I'm really interested in the point that you were talking about too, of like you kind of like you're just starting to feel sympathy for the monster, in that scene. Because I think that's a really interesting point. And Abigail, I think you also make a good point about that like if you know what's coming, that scene starts to feel more sinister than sympathetic.
And sinister earlier, like like you don't have that switch of like, oh, now he's being creepy. Like I feel like he's being creepy the entire time. The kind of questions he's asking, the way he's justifying the way he's pushing at her boundaries.
Yes, but I think what makes it
experience too, which is why I wanted to come back to this. Sorry, Hannah, please go.
I'm just gonna say I think what makes that most interesting for me is the direct implication that because she tells him no is why he kills her. Right? That and I might just be extrapolating more than is necessary, but it's the implication to me seems to be that that's what he's coming every time and asking. Again, not to like bring it back to the Phantom of the Opera, but it seems like every time he's asking for them to accept him and pushing these boundaries with the like express intent, right? If this was a Criminal Minds episode, that would be what they're reading from the villain, right? If this was a detective show, it would be that someone is going from person to person asking if they're going to love him and accept him when he pushes these boundaries. And when they say no, that's when he kills them. Which is then, it makes it more interesting that we actually never see him committing violence. No, not the right word. We never see him brutalize these women. We only see the lead up or the after effects.
Which right, even when No, I was just gonna say that does leave us with this gap.
Right.
We only victim we see the shifter interact with at length is Dean. Like is Becky. Like that's the only victim where we actually get to see, or Sam. And both of those it's very, but also both of those it's an interesting.
And both of those are in the face of Dean. So what this episode gives us is one of the two protagonists committing the only sustained violence in the episode in his face.
But that's what I'm saying is they didn't,
the only sustained violence that we see on.
Yeah.
Which is
what? But we see more. We see more of that interaction. We see more violent and like stressful interaction when he's wearing Dean's face. And like plot wise, of course, like we're more invested, obviously, in the shifter as Dean than we are in the shifter as like random Sam college friend. However, like that's just like meta wise really interesting because then all like the only one we're seeing do sustained violence in the episode is also wearing the face of our protagonist.
And like you said, we're so early in the show that we don't actually, and because we're getting so much of the beginning of the show is from Sam's point of view, we're getting so much more Dean in this episode, but we also haven't spent that much time with him. and now we're going to spend, you know, half of his time in this episode, like probably almost 50% of Jensen's time in this episode are as the shifter.
Right.
I think it's interesting that we don't also deconstruct it. Like at no point in this episode that we see does Dean sort of unpack, hey, someone wearing my face just brutalized you. Right? I think it's interesting that he takes more of a step back from Becky, right? After we watch someone wearing his face ignore her boundaries at the end of the episode, rather than that up front, let me step in front of Sam and shake your hand, he stays back at the car and just waves to her.
That's interesting.
But there's also nothing with Sam, right? There's no... He walks in and he walks over to the body and they exchange this look that to me read as very, hey buddy, that probably was fucked up. But that's as far as they go, right? Dean crouches next to the shifter wearing his body, looks at Sam, picks up the Samulet, and then they don't talk about it.
Which is also makes me think about what you were saying about Dean with performance, is that from the time they realize that the shifter is in Dean's body, Dean's one reaction, he has a very one-note reaction. He is angry, but he is angry not in a like, in a very surface level-y way. He's like, that dude's wearing my face. Like that, like it's not a very like, it's not like it's like you said, it's not like he's reckoning with sort of like the implications of that and the implications of, you know, the shifter hurting Sam in his face. And we're going to see like other instances in the show where there are times that both of these characters are going to get to kind of confront what it's like to experience being hurt by the other one. And that's as much as I can say without giving spoilers. But they're going to have to reckon with that thing. And it's a little unfortunate that they didn't kind of take this opportunity to kind of start to unravel that a little, because that's some of the most interesting stuff, I think, in between their relationship, especially since their relationship at this point, they're just figuring out what that looks like. And they also have like three different conversations about the whole, you know, you can't have friends, you've got to sacrifice, you know, your normal life to be a part of this hunting world. And then we have the shapeshift, like we're getting all these like disconnected sort of like confrontational scenes, but we don't kind of get them all tied together. We don't know if Sam talks to Dean about what the shifter says.
Oh, Abigail, you and I talked about this a little bit in our episode, and I would be wildly shocked if you didn't talk about this in every single other episode. But the way that this show like both leans into and also subverts different like tropes and expectations of masculinity, and in this case, it's both shying away from the like hyper masculine violence, but also leaning into the concept of like, well, yeah, men just don't talk about things. Like, yeah, they're just gonna deal with it, and they're gonna deal with it in the way that they're gonna deal with it, you know.
And it's like, and it's like buying into that and subverting it even in this episode, because they, you know, have a few of those conversations that are kind of blow off conversations, like that are very emotionless, even though they're talking about like something so charged. And then at the end, you know, they do have that little moment of like, you know, Dean apologizing to Sam and being like, I wish things could be different, you know, they can't be, but I wish they could be.
Right.
And that little bit of like them having a real conversation about their feelings. But then even in that conversation, there's a lot of, you know, it's just like because, you know, we things can't be different, you know, because you're a freak and I'm a freak too. And like, I'm with you all the way. And there's both like the avoidance of real emotion and the like, we are trying to talk about real, which I think is very interesting look at, like, even the challenge of like being raised as a man in a society that does not really allow for that kind of vulnerability. So that's the closest that at this point, that's the closest they can get.
Yeah, it's there's a lot happening in sort of every frame of this terrible little episode. Terrible mostly because I have to watch Jensen Ackles do that absolutely awful transformation scene and rip his ear off.
It's so gross. It's
really bad.
It's one of the most horror-y scenes from these early episodes. It's so gross, so unpleasant.
Yeah, it's bad.
I'm glad that they only made us watch the shifter actually shift once. And it was still too long of a scene. I was still like half that length, maybe.
It was still too long.
I'm like half that length. Really, we knew what he was doing. Right. We know so quickly, very quickly. You're like, oh, it's shifting, and then you don't need any more. We don't need to see it.
And then you cut away.
Yeah.
And then that's a moment when Eric Kripke should have said, maybe let's cut away. You know what, guys? Maybe we cut away from this one.
I think Eric Kripke really wanted this to be more of a horror-y show visually than he was ever allowed to make it. And so he leans into these little moments where he could get away with it.
Absolutely.
Like, hey, Eric, maybe we don't watch the teeth pop out one by one. You think?
Oh.
Like, maybe that's our treat.
Is there anything else from like the theme or this episode in general that either of you wants to talk about?
I feel like there was. I'm trying to think of it.
Oh, I did have a note. This actually, sorry. When you asked the question, then you realize you're the one that has something else to say. This is not specifically related to the theme necessarily, but there is the moment. So near the end, after they've killed the shifter, and they're Sam's talking to Becky about, the fact that this is what he does. And there's this look that he gets, and where I really read it as like a look of him being actually proud of what he does as a hunter. I think up till this point, we've really seen Sam be really resistant of like the fact that this is his life. And that's why he's so reticent to talk about it. And now we see this moment of him being proud of the fact that they were able to rescue, like they were able to clear Zach's name. They were able to rescue Becky. And then Becky also identifies, that it must be lonely. And Sam says, no, it's not so bad. And then the shows a shot of him looking at Dean. I think we're starting to see their relationship solidify a little bit. Now that we're a few episodes in, we're seeing Sam wrestle through that initial, I'm only here to find Dad, to now also being proud of the people they're saving, and recognizing that I think he is still lonely. He is still miss his friends, but he's also, I think, starting to re-see Dean as a stability and like as a friend and as a person that that staves off some of that loneliness.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. No.
I think right at the start of the episode, right, they're at the gas station, they're on their way, they're continuing, and Sam checking his email on this ancient Palm Pilot. I think the line that Dean says, right, is that's, well, yeah, your college friends, and also 400 miles back. And then it just cuts to them like squealing out of the gas station. Right, Sam has been so single-minded this whole season, right? And sure, we can find Dad. Let's really find the motherfucker that got Jess. And then I think you're exactly right, right? This is the moment when a friend, someone personal, also needs help that he doesn't even know is going to be related, right? He has this sort of hunch, but
honestly, it doesn't really seem like it.
There's no way.
Most of the reason, I think 90% of the reason for Sam is that he wants to go and reconnect.
Yes. In this exact moment when Dean is pushing that he needs to disconnect, Sam is desperate for reconnection. And he goes back 400 miles out of their way, out of his path, out of his pursuit to see these people and then convince Dean.
And Dean goes along with it without too much resistance. Like he goes, it's like 400 miles. And like he's just finished saying, you know, you can't have friends in this life. And then immediately like listens to Sam when Sam is like, this is important to me. Like Dean also knows chances of this being actually their kind of thing, not super high. And so I think we're also seeing like, we're seeing them both turn towards both each other, but also towards like breaking some of those cycles and like breaking some of that down, like, and not actually towing the party line that I'm assuming is a line from John.
Mm-hmm.
We see them both kind of like pushing against that, testing, you know, is it actually true that we can't have real friends?
Yeah, it really, I think it does call back to the theme, right? Of Dean insists he needs to sacrifice his friends, and Sam instead is willing to sacrifice a not insignificant amount of their sort of quest time to go back and do this. Mm-hmm. Like that is immediately placed on the chopping block and they go. Yeah. Not without hesitation or questioning. I'm sure Dean complains the whole 400 miles, but they do it.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, unless you have something to add on
and
that.
Not only do they, I was just gonna say, not only do they do it, but Dean complaining the whole 400 miles back is not significant enough to make the episode.
He's still going, right?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah,
like Eric Kripke did not say, you know what I need. You know what Eric Kripke said? I would rather keep the shot of Jensen Ackles' fucked up little teeth popping out of his head than any shot of Dean complaining about doing this little backtrack.
Yeah.
That's
full stop.
That's
very true. That's very Dean is, they're juxtaposing Shifter Dean with the actually quite compassionate brother Dean in this episode constantly, which is giving us a lot of interesting character study.
Talk about like chosen Dean. Brother Dean. Talk about choices too, like plot choices. They set Becky up as staying at her parents' house during this, and her parents' house is still 400 miles away, right? At no point were they like, oh, and then Sam has this friend who happens to be the next town up or the state line over. It's very specifically, and I think going back to Claire, I think it was your point, I might be making that up, it kind of goes back to the point we made earlier about this being the episode where Sam starts to come into his own more, of if they literally backtrack and for a case that Sam has to convince Dean is up their alley, for a friend that Sam has kept that Dean thinks he should have cut off, to save them from somebody wearing Dean's face and then move forward, is such a clear sort of commitment that he's been pushed to make this whole time.
Yeah, and Sam at the end, you know, earlier on in the episode, Dean asked like what he's been telling friends, and he's like, I'm telling them I'm taking a bit of a break. But later on when he talks to Becky at the end, it's very final. It does not sound like he is, you know, here for a while and then maybe going back. And maybe he is, and we're still gonna get him kind of working through all of that. But there's almost like a corner has been turned, and this is not a like, I'm trying to get this done as fast as possible so I can go back to my normal life. This is my life, and I don't know what that means yet, but I'm actually 100% in it.
Which weirdly is represented by him telling Becky. Not that she had a choice in finding out at this point. She got sucked in, but but in telling her kind of cements that in a way that Dean never had to. Dean never had a friend to choose between or to tell. And I think Sam walking away from a friend that knows gives it that sense of finality.
I think your analysis of Sam is like spot on there. There is an instance of this with Dean that we are going to see later in this season.
Dun dun. Dun-dun-dun.
I think that probably covers really our theme discussion. Good stuff.
Probably.
We're going to move into a segment that we're calling Going Meta. And this is where we talk about some of the lore of the show. We track a few key elements of the story, and we check in with kind of our pop culture radar. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the category, and then I'll let one of you guys jump in and give us an update based on this episode. First up, significant character deaths.
I want to argue for this being counted as a Dean death.
What do you think, Hannah?
I'm kind of split on it. I mean, technically, somebody who looks like Dean dies, yes. I also think we just talked so much about how unlike Dean they felt.
Maybe I'll make an argument for counting it as...
Wait, Claire, you keep cutting. Say it again.
No, keep going. Keep going.
No, Claire, I want to hear your reasoning for this, and then I'll give, if your reasoning is different than mine, I'll give my reasoning for why I think you're right.
Oh, never mind. No, give your reasoning for why you think I'm right. Never mind. This is great.
Okay, well, I think a reason that it could be argued is not because it's an actual Dean death, because it isn't. It's a shifter that looks like him, but because in the lore of the show and in the world, this is the first time that Dean Winchester dies, and in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of like the world,
yeah,
he's dead.
I will actually accept this. He literally does say that he's sad he's missing his funeral,
which is such a funny line when you think about the rest of the show.
Yeah, the line that made me write down in my notebook, I think we should put this in the death counter, was him going, how many times do you get a chance to see your own funeral? Because it's a lot, Daniel. Hey, Dean, it's a lot.
Yeah. The second thing that we are tracking is the Bechdel test. Hannah, you want to give us an update on that?
Yeah, it failed, babe. 100% failed. I can't think of a single instance where I saw a woman who also saw another woman.
There isn't any in this episode. There isn't one. There's not even a shot, single shot with two women in it. There might be in like one of the random street shots.
Like, no, they weren't even on the street making eye contact. Claire's absolutely losing their mind.
Like, eye contact through a window. Like, there wasn't even like two women talking at like a McDonald's drive-through in the background. No women saw any other women.
This show is so bad. So bad. So bad for women.
They didn't even each other, dude. Sorry, I'm just losing it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, like.
The third thing that we are doing in this segment is our lore check. Basically just talking about how is the show's world building going. I have a couple notes for this one. One is that the shapeshifter specifically, the lore is very unclear in this episode, because the only time that they really talk about the lore is when the shifter is talking about it a little bit, kind of, but it's very unclear as to whether or not that's accurate. Like, was the shifter human? We don't really know. And Sam and Dean don't really come to any sort of like conclusion, and they don't really spend much time even talking about whether or not they need to know where this shifter came from. Because they know how to kill it. That's the only thing they're really focused on. One of the other things we are keeping track of is locations that anyone on this podcast has been to, because I grew up in the area that Supernatural was filmed. However, there's no specific locations in this episode that I really know. Most of the shots are actually in Vancouver, and familiar with the area, but not specific locations. Claire?
At the beginning of the episode, Jensen Ackles says, we'll be in Tucumcari by lunch. And I once played a district golf tournament in Tucumcari, New Mexico. Thank you.
I love that. Next up is our kind of pop culture check-in. There are no fake ID names given in this episode. However, there is one significant pop culture reference that Hannah needs to talk about.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
You had a moment of like not remembering, and I was very upset.
I was really trying. I was like, what on earth are you? No, they do. Dean does reference when they're talking about how the shifter likely has a connection to him being alive, to be able to access his knowledge. He does ask if that's anything like a Vulcan mind meld. And Abigail and I, as the resident Trekkies in the chat, did both have a moment of enjoyment and unrelated pleasure at that distant reference, which Claire did thoroughly mock us for. For those of you who might not know of what a Vulcan mind meld just allows you to understand like what's in someone else's mind. It's very much like it was referenced in the show. I feel fairly confident that if you're listening to this podcast, you have enough background pop lore to understand the reference, but just so that I can get it out there, that'll be the next podcast.
Yes. Our last segment today is blessings. So in this segment, we take a page from Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, as well as the long-standing tradition in a lot of religious communities. And we're each going to bless a character from this episode for any reason that we want to bless them. Yeah, I'm gonna bless Sam in this episode because I think that going back to see his friends after Jess dies has got to bring up all of the memories of her and all of the trauma again. Like, I think, you know, in some ways it'd be easier to just stay on the road and not engage with his old life because that's super painful. And we know he's, you know, reliving that moment with Jess all the time. But he goes and he like is vulnerable with his old friend and just sort of slips back into, I think we get to see a lot of like what he was like as a friend at Stanford, and it's really sweet and it breaks my heart for him. And yeah, I think just like Sam acting with this kind of like vulnerability and courage to face to not compartmentalize his life. He doesn't sacrifice his friends entirely to go off on this hunt. He doesn't entirely cut off all the parts of himself so that it won't be as painful. He actually like engages with them vulnerably, and that's a hard and beautiful thing to do, and I want to bless Sam for it.
So I very specifically, I thought about blessing all of the sort of secondary victims of the shifter, but I really specifically want to bless Zach. I think it's interesting how little screen time we didn't actually see him, right? We saw the shifter as him. One, I think his sister, like Becky, standing up for him to such an extent that she sought out help, that she was willing to sort of go along with these strange men on her step to go as far as they were going to try and get him out of the situation. She never doubted that he wasn't capable of this, that this couldn't have been him. And I think we sort of almost left them on a cliffhanger, right? We're about to fully leave this town, this episode, not knowing what happened to Zach, sort of just know that Becky was safe. And then sort of right at the end, Dean asks, you know, what's happening with them? And Sam mentions, oh, well, they're all blaming it on Dean Winchester now, so Zach is free. But I think, right, I really felt for his plight of coming home and finding the one that he loved brutalized. And I think we kind of, as viewers and sort of in the episode, like skimmed past that. We didn't delve into his plight that much because, right, the emphasis, we were talking about the actual victims, the people who were brutalized. But I think in leaving this episode, that's who I want to bless. Is I hope that, you know, I bless his efforts to move on and find healing. And he never met Sam and Dean. He didn't see any of the effort people were going to. He might not even believe the shifter, which means that he's going to be left sort of questioning himself and his reality. long after they're gone, and I bless his efforts to regain it.
I want to bless that. This is great. We've all just blessed so many different people, and I'm gonna bless Bex, because she just works very hard to try and get her brother out of trouble that she knows he does not deserve, and then also is just like lied to and brutalized by men in this episode, even though like obviously we know that Sam does not, intend anything bad by lying to her or anything, but she's just like going through it, and then also supernatural things are real, and she just has to grapple with that now. Yeah, so I really felt in my heart for her. So that's where mine will be landing.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Claire and Hannah, for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Always, always, always a delight.
And thank you also to anyone who is listening. We wish you a peaceful road till we meet again. Next week, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 7, Hookman, through the theme of gratitude. A note to our listeners. This episode was recorded prior to our Season 3 name change, where we went from Driver Picks the Podcast to Saving People, Queering Things. For all of our new social media platforms, visit queeringthingspodcast.com.